This is a Bigjigs Flying Scotsman battery-operated engine. LNER Class A344-72 Flying Scotsman is a 462 Pacific steam locomotive built in 1923 for the London and North Eastern Railway, LNER, at Doncaster Works to a design of Nigel Gresley. It was employed on long-distance express East Coast Main Line trains by the LNER and its successors, British Railways Eastern and Northeastern regions, notably on the London to Edinburgh Flying Scotsman train service, after which it was named. The locomotive set 2 world records for steam traction, becoming the first steam locomotive to be officially authenticated at reaching 100 miles per hour, 161 kilometers per hour, on November 30, 1934. And then setting a record for the longest non-stop run by a steam locomotive when it ran 422 miles, 679 kilometers, on August 8, 1989, while in Australia. Retired from regular service in 1963, after covering 2.08 million miles, Flying Scotsman enjoyed considerable fame and preservation under the ownership of, successively, Alan Pegler, William McAlpine, Tony Marchington, and finally the National Railway Museum. As well as hauling enthusiast specials in the United Kingdom, the locomotive toured extensively in the United States and Canada from 1969 until 1973, and Australia in 1988 and 1989. Flying Scotsman has been described as the world's most famous steam locomotive. Flying Scotsman is a 462 Pacific locomotive completed in February 1923 in Doncaster Works as the third of 51 Class A1 locomotives built to a design by Nigel Gresley. The A1s were designed for main line and later express passenger services, initially on the Great Northern Railway, GNR, a constituent company of the London and North Eastern Railway, LNER, after the amalgamation of 1923, for which they became a standard design. Flying Scotsman cost £7,944 to build, and initially carried the number 1472, as the GNR had not yet decided on a system-wide numbering scheme. Following amalgamation, in February 1924 the locomotive acquired its name and assigned a new number, 4472. Flying Scotsman became a flagship locomotive for the LNER. It represented the company at the British Empire Exhibition at Wembley Park in 1924 and 1925. In 1928, Flying Scotsman became one of 5 Gresley's 4-6-2s selected to haul the Laner's new prestigious non-stop Flying Scotsman train service from London King's Cross to Edinburgh Waverley. The locomotive hauled the inaugural train on May 1, 1928, completing the journey in 8 hours and 3 minutes. For this, the locomotives ran with a new version of the large 8-wheel tender which held 9 long tons of coal. The tender included a corridor connection which provided access to the locomotive cab from the train to allow a change of driver and fireman without stopping the train. This, and the usual facility for water replenishment from the water trough system, enabled the engines to travel the 392 miles, 631 kilometers, without stopping. Flying Scotsman ran with its corridor tender from April 1928 to October 1936, after which it reverted to the original type. In July 1938, it was paired with a streamlined non-corridor tender, and ran with this type until withdrawal in 1963. On November 30, 1934, Flying Scotsman became the first steam locomotive to reach the officially authenticated speed of 100 miles per hour, 161 kilometers per hour, while hauling a light test train. It earned a place in the land speed record for railed vehicles, and the publicity-conscious LNER made much of the fact. While the Great Western Railway's 3700 class 3440 city of Truro was reported to have reached the same speed in 1904, the record was not official. In 1928, Gresley began to modify the A1 locomotives into an improved version, the Class A3. Flying Scotsman emerged as an A3 on January 4, 1947. Its old 180-psi boiler was replaced with a 225-psi version with the long banjo dome of the type it carries today, and was fitted with more efficient valves and cylinders. In 1959, she was fitted with a double keelchap chimney to improve performance and economy, but it caused soft exhaust and smoke drift that tended to obscure the driver's forward vision. The remedy was found in the German-type smoke deflectors fitted by the end of 1961. Following the success of Gressley's streamlined Class A4S, Flying Scotsman was no longer the Laner's flagship engine and was relegated to lesser duties, but still worked on the main line and hauling passenger services. In 1946, the locomotive was renumbered twice by Gressley's successor Edward Thompson, who devised a comprehensive renumbering scheme for the LNER. 4472 was initially assigned number 502 in January, but an amendment to the system led to its renumbering of 103 4 months later. Following the nationalization of Britain's railways on January 1, 1948, almost all of the LNER locomotive numbers were increased by 60,000, and 103 became 60103 that December. On June 4, 1950, now under British Railways ownership, Flying Scotsman was allocated to its new base at Leicester Central on the Great Central Railway, running passenger services to and from London Marylebone, Leicester, Sheffield, and Manchester. In 1962, British Railways announced that it would scrap Flying Scotsman. No. 60103 ended service with its last scheduled run on January 14, 1963, running the 1315 from London King's Cross to Leeds. Previously proposed to be saved by the Gressley A3 Preservation Society, they were unable to raise the required £3,000, the scrap value of the locomotive, with their Save Our Scotsman appeal. Alan Pegler, who first saw the locomotive at the British Empire Exhibition in 1924, received £70,000 in 1961 for his shareholding in the Northern Rubber Company when it was sold to Pegler's Valves, a company started by his grandfather. When Flying Scotsman was due to be scrapped, Pegler stepped in and bought it outright in 1963 for £3,500, with the political support of Prime Minister Harold Wilson. The negotiations began in January 1961 and took Pegler 18 months to acquire it from British Railways. He spent large amounts of money over the next few months having the locomotive restored at Doncaster Works as closely as possible to its LNER condition. The smoke deflectors were removed. The double chimney was replaced by a single chimney, and the tender was replaced by one of the corridor types of which the locomotive had run between 1928 and 1936. It was also repainted in LNER livery. Pegler's contract with British Railways allowed him to run Flying Scotsman on enthusiast specials until December 31, 1971. It was at the time the only steam locomotive running on the British Railways main line. It worked a number of rail tours. On November 13, 1965, Flying Scotsman claimed the fastest steam-hauled run between London, Paddington and Cardiff, working the Panda Pullman, a fundraising special. It also set the fastest run on the return journey. By the end of 1965, Flying Scotsman had recouped the £3,000 it cost Pegler to buy the locomotive. In the meantime, watering facilities for steam locomotives were disappearing, so in September 1966, Pegler spent £1,000 on a second corridor tender, which was adapted as an auxiliary water tank for a further £6,000. Retaining its through gangway, this was coupled behind the normal tender. This allowed the engine to operate with a total water capacity of around 11,000 gallons. In May 1968, the locomotive completed a non-stop London to Edinburgh run, marking the 40th anniversary of the beginning of the non-stop Flying Scotsman service, and the year steam traction officially ended on BR. A non-stop return journey was made 3 days later. Following an overhaul in the winter of 1968-69, Wilson's government agreed to support Pegler running the locomotive in the United States and Canada to support British exports. To comply with local railway regulations, it was fitted with a cowcatcher, bell, Buckeye couplings, American-style whistle, air brakes and high-intensity headlamp. The tour began on October 8, 1969 with a run from Boston, Massachusetts to Atlanta, Georgia via New York City and Washington, D.C., and continued to Slayton, Texas during the winter. Despite starting well, the tour ran into problems, with some states increasing costs by requiring diesel-headed haulage through them, seeing the steam locomotive as a fire hazard. However, Flying Scotsman completed its journey from Texas to Wisconsin before finishing in Montreal in 1970, and from Toronto to San Francisco in 1971, a total of 15,400 miles, 24,800 kilometers. None of these trips carried paying passengers as it was declared illegal to do so. While in San Francisco, Flying Scotsman ran a series of passenger trips on the San Francisco Belt Railroad and was put on show at Fisherman's Wharf. Although it was a commercial success to begin with, Pegler was 132,000 pounds in debt by the end of 1971 and had the locomotive in storage at the U.S. Army Sharp Depot in Lathrop, California to keep it from unpaid creditors. Pegler worked his passage home from San Francisco to England on a Pando cruise ship in 1971 and began a new career giving lectures about trains and travel. He was declared bankrupt in the High Court in 1972. In 1966, Pegler also purchased a boiler and cylinder parts from its scrapped sister engine, 60041 Salmon Trout. The boiler is housed at the National Railway Museum in York. In February 2004, a debt agency acting on behalf of Flying Scotsman plc announced it would hold a sealed bid auction for the locomotive to be held on April 2nd. Amid media fears it could be sold into foreign hands, the National Railway Museum, NRM, in York announced it would bid and appealed for funds. They succeeded with a bid of £2.3 million, 15% higher than the second highest. The bulk of the money came from a £1.8 million grant from the National Heritage Memorial Fund, with the remainder coming from £350,000 raised from donations, which was matched by Richard Branson, with another £70,000 raised by the Yorkshire Post newspaper. Included in the sale was the A3 pattern spare boiler, built in 1944 and carried by Flying Scotsman from 1965 to 1978, spare cylinders and an MK1 support coach. The locomotive arrived in York in time to be exhibited as part of the museum's Railfest 2004, a celebration of 200 years of rail travel. Under pressure from donors, instead of being placed on static display, it was decided to use the locomotive for charter trains out of York, as well as on the Scarborough Spa Express, although problems with its condition soon became apparent. Having failed on the delivery trip to Railfest, arriving on tow. After considerable remedial work, it then proceeded to fail numerous times in the following months, with the museum's engineering staff kept constantly busy effecting running repairs, but failed to spot critical faults that would delay the subsequent overhauls and restoration. From September 2004 until May 2005, it was put into the workshops for a heavy intermediate repair, the intention being to improve reliability and allow operation until its general overhaul and restoration. The intermediate repair failed to improve reliability, and so the decision was taken to go ahead with the overhaul and restoration. In January 2006, Flying Scotsman duly entered the NRM's workshops for a major overhaul to return it to Gressley's original specification and to renew its boiler certificate. It was initially estimated that this would only take 1 year and cost around £750,000. The bay in which the locomotive was being refurbished was on view to visitors to the NRM, but the engine was rapidly dismantled to such an extent that the running plate was the only component recognizable to the casual observer. In anticipation of the restoration, the spare A3 boiler had been dispatched in June 2005 to Riley and Son in Barry, Greater Manchester, to be completely rebuilt. It was to be used instead of the A4 boiler, both out of the desire to restore the locomotive to original condition, and because it was deemed that the A4 boiler had deteriorated into a worse state than the spare due to the higher operating pressures the locomotive had experienced following the uprating of the locomotive to 250 psi during its last private overhaul. Deemed surplus to requirements. The A4 boiler was sold to Jeremy Hosking for potential use on his locomotive, LNER Class A4 4464 Bittern. In July 2007, the museum pushed back the expected completion date by 18 months, due in part to issues with the boiler restoration. By January 2009, with further problems encountered including misaligned frames and a cracked right-hand cylinder, as well as due to rising metal prices, the museum launched the SOS, Save Our Scotsman, appeal, seeking to raise a further £250,000, hoping to complete the work by 2010. In May 2011, the locomotive was unveiled on the museum's turntable, finished in wartime black LNER livery. Following final testing, it was planned to finish it in LNER apple green and have it running excursions by the summer. In June 2011, cracks were discovered in the horn blocks, which led to further testing which discovered numerous latent cracks throughout the frame assembly, leading to the replacement of the main stretcher bar, horn ties and middle cylinder motion bracket, all of which were deemed beyond repair. In October 2012, with the project still unfinished, the museum published a report examining the reasons for the delay and additional cost. It found that the museum had greatly underestimated the work required due to the poor condition of the locomotive, much of which had been missed by a rushed inspection, which produced an overly optimistic assessment which was not based on engineering realities. It also found that once the project was underway, management lacked the experience, continuity or resources to undertake such a complex task, which was also hampered by illness and recruitment issues. Although the museum had a formal contract system to manage suppliers, managers failed to implement it properly, and it was ill-suited to the cottage industry nature of the heritage railway sector which the suppliers were largely drawn from, many of whom had failed to meet their contractual targets. Problems were also caused by the conflicting objectives of producing a certified mainline locomotive while retaining as many original components and assemblies as possible, and between the need to overhaul the locomotive and use it as a marketing tool for the museum. The report recommended that the NRM consider the scope, size and responsibilities of their project management and engineering functions and their contracting policy. Following the report, the NRM commissioned first-class partnerships, FCP, to independently review the remaining work identified as necessary by the NRM and make recommendations on how to proceed. In March 2013, the museum announced FCP had determined the locomotive would not return to the main line until 2015 and believed the outstanding work should be put out to external tender. On October 29, 2013, the museum announced Riley and Son as the winning contractor, and the same day the locomotive was moved to their workshop in order to return it to running condition no earlier than the summer of 2015. On April 29, 2015, Flying Scotsman's boiler left the NRM to be reunited with the rest of the locomotive. 3 months later, as restoration neared completion, it was estimated to have the locomotive back in service by early 2016 with new electronic equipment needed to operate on the main line. The final cost of the restoration amounted to £4.5 million, having risen by a £300,000 estimate in the summer of 2015 due to the further necessary work and the need to meet the deadline for the return to service. The overhaul was completed in January 2016, and testing began on the East Lancashire Railway on January 8, 2016, with the locomotive still wearing its 2011 wartime black livery with the number 60103 on the smokebox, and its LNER wartime numbers 103 and 502 on the cab sides. Flying Scotsman was originally planned to haul its inaugural mainline train, the Winter Cumbrian Mountain Express, from Manchester, Victoria to Carlisle on January 23rd. But it was cancelled due to faulty brakes. The first mainline run took place on February 6, hauling the Winter Cumbrian Mountain Express from Carnforth to Carlisle. On February 25, Flying Scotsman ran from London King's Cross to York in its BR Brunswick green livery. The train was forced to stop due to members of the public trespassing on the line near St. Neots. Flying Scotsman has completed various tours throughout Great Britain since 2016. In 2017, It was chosen to lead an excursion train for the reopening of the Settle Carlisle line following damage caused by a landslip in 2015 and 2016. On October 13, 2018, Flying Scotsman hauled the Alan Pegler farewell special from London King's Cross to York, organized at the request of his daughter. In his will, Pegler requested for half of his ashes to be placed in the firebox of the locomotive as it ascended Stoke Bank. In April 2022, Flying Scotsman will be withdrawn for an overhaul in preparation for its centenary year in 2023. In 2011, the National Railway Museum announced that Flying Scotsman would be painted in LNER wartime black livery when it underwent steam tests and commissioning runs, with the letters NE on the sides of its tender. Number 103 on one side of the cab and 502 on the other, the numbers it was given under the Laners renumbering system. The locomotive remained in black for the NRM's Flying Scotsman preview event on 28 to 30 May 2011. During the museum's Railfest event on 2 to 10 June 2012, Flying Scotsman was kept in front of Mallard in a siding in its black livery. A report on the restoration was published, in redacted form, on March 7, 2013. On January 23, 2015, the NRM announced that the smoke deflectors and double chimney would be retained, including a return to its BR green livery, to keep it as historically accurate as possible as No. 60103. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe our channel.
Okay, I go for restroom here.